I'd like to welcome you to session 2 of the Logic Books Festival. Over the course of the next 3 days, we'll be exploring the way we interact with technology and how it affects our lives. We'll also be celebrating an important new collaboration between Logic Magazine and the publisher FSG Originals. Logic Magazine was founded over 3 years ago with the aim of exploring technology and its effects on culture and deepening the discourse around technology. Its founders and editorial staff came from a unique position in that they were embedded in the worlds of the tech industry and tech culture and are qualified to offer a very critical eye. Logic is published 3 times a year and challenges the promises that tech industry make versus what it actually delivers. A specific theme is chosen for each seasonal issue and then rigorously explored in all of its aspects. Logic's goal has always been to ask the right questions about technology and how we are impacted by it. So over the course of this evening and the next 3 days, we'll be considering many of the issues explored by Logic and give a showcase for several of the important books to come out of this collaboration between Logic and FSG Originals. Before we begin, I would like to bring attention to the good work of Gray Area, our co-presenter and producer of tonight's event. Gray Area is a cultural center and educational hub located in San Francisco's Mission District. Their mission is to apply art and technology to create social and civil impact through education, incubation, and public events. They use digital tools to create art, design projects to benefit society. To learn more about their calendar of events and workshops, please do visit grayarea.org. City Lights is honored and thrilled to be working with them once again on this really, really fantastic project. So our second session tonight is called Subprime Attention Crisis, Advertising and the Time Bomb at the Heart of the Internet. It is named after the book of the same title. As for each event, over the course of the next few days, there is a featured title. There are 4 new books in the series, and we're happy to be featuring them all over the course of the week. We're going to be posting links in the chat function on the dashboard of your screens with which you can purchase copies of the book. Our speaker for this session is the author Tim Hwang. He'll be in conversation with Allison Arieff. Tim Hwang is a writer and researcher. He is the former director of the Harvard-MIT Ethics and Governance of AI Initiative, and previously served as the global policy lead for artificial intelligence and machine learning at Google. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wired, The Atlantic, as well as many other publications. He makes his home now in New York City. He's going to be joined in conversation by Allison Arieff. Allison Arieff writes on design and is currently the editorial director for the urban planning and policy think tank SPUR. She writes about architecture, design, cities, and technology, and she makes her home in San Francisco. Welcome to you both, and thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Okay, Tim, we're going to kick it off.
Sure.
So it was great to read your book because I love where your brain goes all the time. It was also making me think of all kinds of funny advertising things, including one I hadn't thought of in a long time, but crystallized in my brain, which I don't know if this was a long time ago, so I'm probably going to date myself, but I'm sure you've come across it. The book cover that had the cocktail glass and it was supposed to say sex in the ice cubes in the glass.
Right, yeah.
And it was like the big subliminal advertising thing that when you were young, you're like, ooh, it's like the...
Right, they're like manipulating our minds.
So it just made me think kind of the long tradition of various applications of snake oil. Sure. So it was fun. But this is a heady title, and in its way, both a light and heady topic. And so I'm wondering if you could give us the elevator pitch for Subprime Attention Crisis.
Sure, definitely. So the starting place is something that is so core to the function of the internet that I think we often forget about it. And that core thing is the fact that advertising is the financial engine that has driven the modern web, right? I think on the recent financial filings, it still accounts for about 80% of Google's revenue. It accounts for over 90% of Facebook's revenue. And it really has been the thing that has allowed these companies to scale and grow to massive size in such a short amount of time. And this business model has seemed so bulletproof for so long that we have kind of stopped talking about, ad technology and how advertising works online. And so what's really interesting is even among people who work in the tech industry, how the sort of programmatic advertising system works. And that's the kind of advertising that you see online. The core business model of the internet is kind of a rumor in some ways. And really the kind of core of the book, right, is to kind of like explore that rumor, right? And say, okay, you know, when you talk about Google now, you mostly think of self-driving cars and uncomfortable open letters and, you know, disturbing partnerships with the military industrial complex. But really, what is this thing that generates the Willy Wonka waterfall of money into these companies? And I think what's most interesting as you start to dig into that is a lot of the claims of sort of the superiority of online advertising, the power and pervasiveness of this financial engine. Really looks like it might be based on nothing, right? That actually what we have found in constructing this huge financial engine is not really a real genuine marketplace, but in fact a bubble, right? And it sort of asks the question, what happens when this thing that has sort of powered growth for, you know, really the past 25 years, you know, whether or not those foundations are a lot more tenuous than we think, and what are the implications for the web as a whole? And so that's the elevator pitch.
Okay, very well done. I should also mention to our audience, welcome, by the way, everyone, that please put your questions in the Q&A and we will absolutely have time for your questions in the end, and we would love to hear them. So you have said that this book is both a critique of tech companies and a critique of tech critics. So maybe you can explain your thinking around that.
Definitely, yeah. My genuine hope with the book is that it annoys almost about everybody, and I think that if that is accomplished, the book is really doing its job. Because on one hand, I think there are people that you talk to in the tech industry that say, yes, this data-driven, micro-targeted advertising is the bee's knees, right? It can find anyone that you want to communicate with and deliver a persuasive message to them, right? And this is in fact really what Facebook is selling when it sells online advertising and when it sells things like political advertising. On the same token, actually, maybe the flip side of the coin, really, I think tech critics have often bought those claims by industry, often because it's so dramatic and it's such a thing to wrestle with, right? You're like, oh, Mark Zuckerberg, we should really resist him because he literally has a mind control array, right? And that's really what Facebook is. And I think to those people, I think the thing is when you start to look at the evidence, it's sort of unclear whether or not those claims are genuinely the case, right? And you know, it sort of asks the question, should our tech critique really be built on sort of the marketing claims of the tech industry, right? And should we in fact, you know, maybe resist these companies, resist what they do for reasons other than sort of the claimed power that they have? And there's a lot of wonkiness that I'm sure we'll get into about, you know, where these claims break down. But that's really the hope, is that, you know, I think it's to reground tech critique in something that isn't based on just marketing language, but also just to attack the marketing itself.
Well, it does strike me as both odd and sort of amazing. It's like, one, advertising isn't new. It's manifested itself in different forms over the century, more. And people always go, advertising, it doesn't work, it's so annoying. And yet, no one has found a better way. So what's my question? What is it about advertising? It's just, to me, it just seems like such the lazy business model at this point. Think of something else. Why has no one thought of anything else?
Yeah.
To rest the whole foundation of
to keep this whole internet thing running. Yes. I think that's right? Like I think one of the things that the book points out is, you know, despite, you know, a huge change in how the internet looks and functions, you know, since the late 90s, early 2000s to now, this core business model has largely stayed the same. And to go to, you know, if you were on the last panel, to kind of bring up a theme that came up there, what's really interesting is that the tech industry and sort of the advertising giants of the internet really have sold their advertising as something distinct and different from earlier generations of ads, right? So if you're familiar with the Wanamaker Law, right, which is the adage in advertising, which is that half the money I spend on advertising is wasted, I just don't know which, right? The argument in the early days of Google and Facebook, right, and all the other companies that have built on online advertising is, Well, look, unlike the old days of magazines and billboards, right? You should buy online advertising because it is so much more measurable, so much more trackable, and thereby so much more effective than the advertising that you know before, right? And that's one of the interesting things I think about the online advertising ecosystem is that there is, in fact, a lot of data, but there's a question about what all that data actually ends up amounting to, right? So maybe two kind of incidents that may be food for thought for the discussion. One of them is just a few years ago, Procter Gamble, right? One of the biggest advertisers decided to cut about $200 million out of their digital ad spend, right? Just cut it over a year or two. And what they discovered is absolutely no impact on their market share or sales. In fact, their reach of their advertising slightly increased about 10%, right? Which I think begs the question, what was that $200 million going to, if not to actually shift behavior? So that's one. And you could argue, well, okay, Procter & Gamble, they have a somewhat adversarial relationship with online advertisers. They might want to kind of play some games to put some pressure on them. But then we have this study that comes out of Google not too long ago, which basically says that about 56% of ads online are never seen at all, right? They're delivered, they actually end up in someone's browser, but they've been placed like below the fold, right? Or in a place where you can't really see it.
Or in ice cubes.
Or in ice cubes, right, exactly. And I think the shocking thing is, okay, so this is Google, right? A company that has an interest to sell this product as much as possible. And their own discovery suggests that half of ads are never seen, right? And I think what all this adds up to is despite all the data we have about ads, right? There's a question about whether or not that data is really useful or effective, but also whether or not this actually ends up being much of a differentiator from, the subliminal advertising of the 70s, right? And whether or not the kind of hucksterism around advertising itself is something that's just sort of continuing, but with sort of the cloak of data around it. And I think there is really interesting questions about like how much is online advertising different or better or more effective than what has come before.
Well, you sort of haven't answered my question, but it was unfair. But well, it's an unfair question. So you bring up the reality in your book that increasingly people are finding more and more ways to not look at ads. And of course, that ends up becoming the people who can afford to do that or have the tech savvy to do that, like to get the Hulu subscription that doesn't have the ads or, stuff like that. So then it begins to even further exacerbate income inequality while weirdly keeping the ads from the people who have the disposable income. So talk a little bit about that also.
Yeah, absolutely. So needless to say, right, like ad blocking is on the rise, right? And there is definite sort of socioeconomic patterns in who adopts things like ad blocking. I think increasingly also a number of companies are starting to say, look, we can provide you with privacy preserving features, right? But you pay premium for them, right? And in many cases, right, like to buy the ad-free version is a premium add-on. And I do think that ultimately ends up producing a kind of two-class system. And I think is one of the questions that is asked by the book, right? Which is, there's lots of problems with the advertising ecosystem. But one of the things you can legitimately say for it is that it has made the products more accessible to more people, right? And so one of the big challenges is, okay, well, if we want to move away from advertising as a system, right? What replaces it and what can replace it in a way that doesn't produce, a world where, say, everything is subscription, right? And therefore limits access to certain types of certain groups within society. And I think it's one of the big policy questions I think facing this system that we've gotten ourselves into.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, for someone who's been in media for a really, really long time, I'll give a couple examples. When I was editor-in-chief of Dwell magazine, and you could get a subscription to Dwell for, I don't know, $8 sometimes, for a monthly magazine, because it was on an ad model, not a subscription model. And I'd always say, why are we charging, like 50 cents a magazine? Like, it makes no sense. And the salespeople would always say, this is how it's been done. If you raise the price this much money, like, people won't subscribe. And they never had any data for that. Yet it was this constant, like, mythological certainty that you couldn't ever, and still you could subscribe to magazines for $1 now, for a year. And it's still this dependence. And so it just seems that there's a fear. It's sort of like making the same mistake over and over again, because that's better than trying something new. And when you do try something new, it's like so easy to default. Have you seen any, I mean, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Have you seen any hopeful moves out of this advertising dependence? And maybe just anecdotal at this point, and we can have a bigger conversation.
Sure, definitely. Well, yeah, I think there's two threads to kind of pull on there. One's related to your previous question, and the other one is a direct answer to your question. I mean, I think the direct answer is one of the critiques I've gotten from folks in the ad industry about the book so far has been, well, look, people spend money on it, and they wouldn't spend money on it if it didn't make any sense. And so isn't that proof that advertising works? Which I think is like so intriguing, and one of the reasons I wanted to draw the comparison to financial bubbles, right? Because it's a very clear example in which like a large amount of financial activity or a movement of capital doesn't necessarily reflect underlying value, right? And I do think that one of the things that keeps the wheel turning is the fact that you have actually perverse incentives on all sides, right? That it turns out that ad tech companies have a lot of interest to tout the benefits of ad tech, right? And marketing agencies working on behalf of their clients want to show that they're doing the cutting edge, cool digital thing. And so they have a lot of reasons to show that those ads work, right? And then middle managers at those brands want to show that they're higher ups, that digital advertising works, right? And in many cases, there's also even more kind of perverse sort of fraud incentives that are kind of going on there, right? And I do think that one of the reasons we don't see sort of substantive shifts away is largely because of this, right? And I think one of the things I'm sure we'll pick up on, right, is whether or not sort of the COVID-related induced sort of downturn in the media is raising these bigger questions that might shake loose some bad trajectories that we might otherwise have had, right? I think the second thing, though, that's related to this question, right, this question of like, well, we do it this way because we've always done it this way. Is that I do think that advertising has also allowed us to put off some of the hardest, most thorny policy questions around the internet, right? Because the services have been offered effectively for free, we have actually not really needed to confront the question of, okay, which ones are actually ones that we think are critical to your, your human condition, as a citizen in the 20th century, right? Which we would have to confront if everybody had to pay a subscription, right? And so I do think that one of the kind of like implicit incentives that has also kept this ball rolling is that it's also been a convenient way to kind of like forestall some of the very hard policy questions that are sort of lurking around the corner. The minute you say, okay, everybody needs to start paying for access here, right? And really kind of ask the question of like, okay, is there room, for example, for public assistance to access some of these services? And if so, what would that look like, right? That's all swept under the rug because of advertising. But again, I'm kind of going off on a segue here. So
no, it's super interesting, and obviously, who knows? Let's say 1999, 2000, if all of a sudden every media entity hadn't said, yeah, sure, like the site's free. If everything hadn't launched free, like, how it would have all turned out, it's anyone's guess.
Right. And I think this is one of the worries that I have is basically like whether or not this moment in the construction of the web and in constructions of public attitudes around the web, we've just set the psychological price of certain types of things at $0.00, which makes it really, really hard for alternatives to emerge, right?
Yeah.
And I do think one of the questions, if you're interested in creating sort of like structural change in the business models of the web, is this very deep question of, okay, so how do you shift this mass psychology around, oh, I look at news and my implied price is $0.00, right? That getting over that gap, I think, is a really hard one.
Yeah, no, agreed. Having written for the Times during a brief period when my section of opinion was behind a paywall, and 8 people would read the story, and then, like you'd have like 8 comments, right? And then the New York Times was like, forget it, we're not going to do the paywall. And then you'd have 600, whatever. You could see sort of people's willingness to engage. It just also strikes me that even though we've improved our means of collecting data, we've also improved our means of bullshitting about its effectiveness.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And And it's almost like the market seeks a metric, but it doesn't necessarily care whether or not that metric is valuable, right? Or is a proxy for anything in particular. And so I do think that one of the really interesting things of like, doing this deep dive into advertising is that really advertising ends up being almost like a lens through which to read everything online, right? Like, why do you have the listicle? Well, on one hand, it's a convenient way of showing you lots of images, but on the other hand, it like totally boosts time on site, right? And that's like critical for maximizing ad revenue. And so it's kind of like these dimensions, right, which may or may not actually be related to like attention per se, right, are still drive content and reshape content. And it's related to a story that I came across. There's a great series of books by this fellow by the name of Eric Barnow that came out in the 70s about sort of, it's the history of radio, the rise of radio networks, and then its emergence into the sort of TV era. And one of the things he points out is like that the invention of the sitcom was largely based on a need to create sort of standardized characters that would recur over and over and over again, which made it very easy for companies to sign off when they were sponsoring shows, right? So you just send them a brief, like this is a show about a husband and a wife and they argue, right? And once the client has signed off on that, you can just easily slot advertising in. And so there's all these kind of dimensions to which like, and I agree with you, right? Like this is like a longstanding story about how advertising shapes content and the other way around.
Yeah, I mean, I think just once talking to someone like, oh yeah, well, we've started writing perfume stories, so we can get perfume advertisers, who no one wants to read a perfume story, or just to give an example. You had spoken as relates to this about this shift from intuition, or we were talking about this a little bit earlier, intuition-driven content curation to data-driven content curation, a shift that I don't like. I think that, that left all to data, you kind of get like the experience we've all had when you're on Instagram where it says, apparently I'm someone who likes scented candles and reading glasses, like just how reduced to typology you are. So, but maybe you can speak about that shift from intuition to data-driven curation.
Sure, absolutely. So there's kind of two dimensions I've been thinking about a lot on this front. One of them is just how bad content recommendation algorithms are, and in connection, advertising delivery mechanisms are. My friend Waldo Jaquith, I think he was retweeting someone, but it was an amazing story where someone was like, "Yeah, I bought a bunch of numbers to hang on my house, just to kind of like for my street number, right?" And Amazon was like, "Oh, you like metal numbers now," and just kept suggesting other numbers that you should purchase, which I think is like brilliant, and I think is like, despite all the data that Amazon has, right? Like the best you could squeeze out was this dude likes numbers, right? And I think this is actually,
there's no discernment,
That's right. And so there's a dream that kind of like that your value increases as a direct proportion or maybe a square of the data that you collect. But actually, I don't think that's the case, right? And we have a lot of evidence of that. And it occurs in the advertising space as well, right? Which is that you've collected huge amounts of data about people. But it actually turns out that that data is frequently faulty. That data has no relevance to what the person's actually interested in. And I think this plays out in really interesting and perverse ways. One of the stories I think we were talking about earlier today was the UK privacy regulator came out with a report on Cambridge Analytica, right? As sort of their statement. And the report annoyed a lot of people because the conclusion of that was, well, maybe all this psychographic advertising that Cambridge Analytica was selling actually sort of meant nothing in the end, right? That actually maybe it didn't really lead to better messaging or shape the election or shape the Brexit vote at all. And I think we're left with this really interesting story, which is like, does all this data, actually amount to anything, right? And so this is a very long way of kind of returning to your question, right? Which is sort of like the battle between sort of data-driven curation and sort of intuition-driven curation. And we have lots and lots of cases in which this sort of like perceived value of data-driven sort of content creation and curation really isn't amounting to much, right? It actually isn't producing things that people like. I think, I don't know if that's necessarily an argument in favor of intuition-driven creation, but at least argues that the two should be sort of considered on par, right? And that like one is sort of like one is a dressed up version of the other quite frequently.
Right. I mean, you might want a little bit of both. I mean, I think that that data question speaks to just a sort of larger issue of data, which I will divert for 1 second out of this into another thing that I know that you've worked on is data in autonomous vehicles, right? Does the collection of data inherently translate to successful performance of that? I know that this is something that you've worked on, if that question makes sense. I think the argument is like, we've driven 1 million miles, 1 billion miles, et cetera. We've collected all this data along the way. I wonder if you could speak to that in terms of usefulness, and then we'll get back to subprime.
Yeah, I think that's very similar in a lot of ways, right? And I guess what you have in the autonomous driving case, right, is there's a question about like, what is the data you're collecting? And I guess what is the signal that's underlying that data that you think that you're picking up, right? Mm-hmm. So you might hear an impressive statistic like, oh, we've driven X million number of miles, right? But if those miles are all on completely flat roads, right, in long highways, right, mm-hmm. there's a question of whether or not it's just ready to deal with the driving culture of a San Francisco or an LA or New York. And again, I think that's actually similar to kind of bring it back to the advertising case about like, okay, does the demographic targeting that we've come up with, right, is it really just generating a really good model of a human that doesn't actually exist? Mm-hmm. And does it render sort of results, right, that are kind of inconsistent with what we actually want, right? And I think the irony of a world in which you believe that most marketing statistics are garbage, right, is that the market can continue even if that's the case, right? Which is that so long as the ad buyer is satisfied, the market keeps mm-hmm. running. And so the question of whether someone's actually engaged with it is almost beside the point, right? Which I think is a very sort of perverse outcome, right? Which is that there's this like other game going on as we're sort of like floating through social media that has sort of nothing to do with us, right? And shapes our experience of the web, but may not actually, influence us in the way that people frequently think.
Right, and the extent to which, back to advertising, it influences outcomes in ways that are kind of monumental, sort of like Facebook's pivot to video, which sent everyone scrambling to produce video content based on what seemed to me someone going like, oh, video is cool. Like, it wasn't much more than that, right? And it just shifts like the total iceberg of content creation in another direction just because of what turned out to be faulty information.
Right. And it goes back to a little bit what we were talking about earlier, right? Which is you can use advertising as a lens through which to kind of like read the internet, right? Which is, I think, one of the reasons why it's a useful way of thinking about the web, because I think it influences everything from as large scale, right, as Facebook being like, okay, y'all are working on video now, right? To even incredibly small things, right? One of the things I talk about in the book, which I kind of love doing almost as a parlor game, right, is like, why do we have a like button? Right? Like, why does a like button even exist, right? It's on Spotify, it's on Facebook, it's every kind of social media just has a default like button. And the reason is because you need to increase the legibility, right? You need to measure whether or not someone's engaged with your content or, to develop a very crisp profile of their interests. And so the easiest way to do that is have a button where they explicitly say like, I like this thing. And again, right, this is like such a common basic affordance that we don't even think about, right? But is actually still like deeply tied, right, to the advertising economy.
Well, it's funny, it reminds me of, and I'm sure you saw this great, I can't remember who did it. It was this great piece where they were analyzing the user interface of the New York subway ticket machine. And they had to put that square just that said start because people couldn't figure out what they were doing unless they could actually just push a button that said start. And there's no other reason to have that button other than that. I thought that was sort of a fascinating human behavior. Like, I need permission to do this. And
right.
It's
very connected.
You can do it. Let's talk about the subprime mortgage metaphor. How are these things alike?
Sure, definitely. So the kind of argument of the book, the sort of kind of twist ending or twist middle, if you will, of the book, right? It's certainly in the second act, right? Is to basically argue that like, advertising is not just the commercialization of the web, right? And it's not really just the commercialization of attention, because as we've talked about, right, like attention has been commercialized for decades and decades and decades, right? And so there's nothing new about the idea that you would sell advertising against a content, right, or a thing that people are paying attention to. What the book argues is that the kind of market that we've seen develop for buying and selling attention online, right, is a specific kind of commodified, financialized market, right? And it's a market which is, as I mentioned earlier, that's known in the industry as programmatic advertising, right? And this is essentially high frequency trading by algorithm, right? Which is the moment you load a website, at that point you load a website, a lot of people don't know this, but they don't even know what ad you're going to see, right? There's an instantaneous auction that occurs at that time to figure out what the ad is, right? And that happens in a split second. It happens between the time when you click on it and when the time the website loads. And sort of the argument of the book, and this is actually not me just saying this, but was actually kind of explicit in a lot of the early development of the system, was we're going to build this advertising market like the stock market, and we're going to build it like a modern day capital market. And so the argument of the book is basically that, well, we can look to the pathologies of sort of modern capital markets as a way of thinking about what might happen to the markets of the web. And I think there's sort of three things that I kind of argue are very similar to the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008. And if you indulge with me, it's kind of like metaphors are usually meant to make things clearer, but unfortunately the 2008 crisis is itself really complex. But I think there's kind of three arguments that I make, really. One of them is around opacity, right? Which is, in the subprime mortgage crisis, people were buying and selling these packages of mortgages, but they actually had no idea what was kind of like lurking underneath, right? Which is a bunch of these toxic assets. And that's effectively the argument of the book, right? Which is basically that you have these algorithms buying and selling attention all the time, but it's actually unclear whether or not anyone's actually paying attention to those ads, whether or not those ads actually work. And it's also unclear whether or not it's easy to understand that that's the case, right? From the outside, ad technology is incredibly opaque. It can be very difficult to see what's going on. And so the first factor is really opacity. The second one is kind of the subprime nature of attention, right? Which is a little bit what we've been talking about, right? Which is the fact that you've got things like the rise of ad blocking. You've got the kind of rise of ad fraud. You've got all these perverse incentives, right? A little bit like the subprime mortgage crisis. There were sort of banks that had incentives to kind of keep this market moving along. It's very much the kind of similar situation that you have here. And then the final one is really, this question about like, there's this kind of hair trigger, right? Which is, when will the sort of confidence in this market run out? And one of the things that the book argues is basically that the ad market has kind of made a lot of things about the internet economy extremely brittle. And so there are these potential situations where a small set of failures could create a big cascading effect in the marketplace, because suddenly people realize, oh, okay, actually this thing I thought that was incredibly valuable actually might be worth nothing. And so it sort of uses sort of the subprime economy as a way of thinking about, are there parallels between sort of the market that we have today in advertising, and is it a way of thinking about what might go wrong? And that's sort of the lay of the land.
Got it. Talk about how you see it as Nimbyism for the attention economy.
Sure. Well, this is something I've just been riffing about. I'm really interested.
I should never assume that everybody knows this, but NIMBY is not in my backyard, which is a sort of housing term used for people who oppose housing of every stripe that is not their own house. Sorry.
Right. So the origin of this is, as someone who's written a book which just takes the 2008 financial crisis and does a very, very extended metaphor way beyond what you should do in any reasonable book. I'm really interested in kind of exploring like what metaphors are useful for sort of understanding what we have in the internet, right? Because again, this is sort of the interesting sort of game, I think, of the web, right? Uber says, we're not a taxi cab company, we're a transportation network company, right? And I think this is the question ultimately always with a lot of things online, which is, what exactly are we dealing with, right? And I love the sort of metaphor of the subprime mortgage crisis, but because I think it just allows you to kind of like chase down and come up with sort of a bunch of interesting ideas in this space. And so the kind of like thing I was joking about online about sort of attentional Nimbyism, you know, the phrase living rent free in your mind, right? And I was thinking about that, and actually that's a very poetic way of expressing an idea, but it also suggests all these things about using the sort of real estate metaphor as a way of thinking about attention online. And I do think that we do have a fair number of attentional NIMBYs, right? Basically people who say, well, I really want to, I have the resources basically to protect my attention, right? And there's a bunch of things that I can demand for myself, right? And so long as you're not interfering with my backyard, my brain,
Right.
I'm sort of happy, right?
Yeah.
And I think we do sort of see this in kind of the sort of one sort of scenario where this ends up, right? Which is the world in which these companies say, okay, for those who can pay, we will allow you to kind of exist in this world which has no attempt to kind of consume your attention, right? But you've paid us the value of that. And then in some ways, the harm of that is sort of pressed off to everybody else.
Right.
And I do think that's a kind of, again, a very valuable way of thinking about like, how do we import the politics of, say, urbanism into thinking about sort of like the politics of the web?
Nice. Something that many people may not know about you is that you trained to be a magician at the Magic Castle. That was, I have to tell you, no one likes writing letters of recommendation. I actually wrote a letter of recommendation to the Magic Castle for Tim. It was the most fun I had writing anything in a long time. And so when we were talking, we just sort of decided that magic that came in use here in ways that you might not have anticipated it, in that it is all kind of a little bit of magic, the stuff we're talking about. So maybe you can speak to that just a little bit.
Sure, I think that's right. And man, I have to say the Magic Castle's been, it's in the culture war, and that's like a whole other thing I could talk about right now, which is like totally fascinating. But yeah, I mean, I do think that the sort of like theory of performing magic, and for anyone who's on the line, this may seem like very, very far left field, but let me connect it to it, because I actually think it's quite useful as a way of thinking about it. In magic, there's sort of the notion of motivation in your movements, right? And there's a lot of discussion about what the external reality is that the audience sees, and what the sort of internal reality of the performer is, right? And sort of the goal of magic frequently is that every motion you have on stage should be motivated, right? Which is, even when you're kind of hiding something from the audience, you can't like quickly stuff your hand into your pocket, right? Because people would be like, what's that guy doing with a hand in his pocket? What you need to do is you need some reason to reach into your pocket, right? To pull out a dove or a magic wand or what have you. And again, I do think that this is actually one way of thinking about sort of like the sort of front stage and backstage of the design of these platforms, right? Because again, as we've talked about, right, like when we talk about Facebook, we talk about the features, right? Oh, they've got this feature that creates stories on Instagram, right? Even if you're a critic, you talk about the features. You talk about how the recommendation algorithm creates polarization, right? And is bad for our civic politics, right? But in some ways, all these things operate at the front stage, right? They're in fact the things that the company wants you to see, right? And I think that in many ways, a lot of these motions are frequently motivated in nature, right? To go back to the like button, right? You can see the like button either as, oh, here's a way that's really easy for Tim to see that Allison likes his content, right? The other way of reading it is it's a way of measuring advertising, right? Another one is the profile. Why do platforms ask you to create a profile? Well, on one hand, it's really easy for people to find people of similar interests, right? On the other hand, it's a really easy way to compile dossiers about what people like and don't like to sell them advertising. And so I do think that like the performance of the platform, right, is actually deeply embedded in something like sleight of hand, right? Because it's all about how do you control attention and how do you create good motivations for what you're doing. And I do think that in some ways, like it or not, right, whether or not you are a big tech booster or a big tech critic, one of the things I think that needs to kind of enter into the sort of discussion about how we say break the power of the platforms is how do we create sort of breakdowns in that stagecraft, right? Because I think it has been so well crafted. And in some ways, like, even though the companies even though the public is moving on, I think in some ways the companies are still playing the same game, right? And so I do think that there's a lot to dig into there in terms of, kind of thinking about these two levels at which the game is being played.
I look forward to the actual trick that you developed that is called the Subprime Attention Crisis. I want to have time for audience questions, but in this book by Jenny Ophil, she talks about how environmentalists always have to end climate change stories on the obligatory note of hope, like all is not lost. You can recycle your cardboard or whatever.
Right.
So we're screwed. The internet's falling apart. Advertising doesn't work. It's a shaky foundation. What can we do about it?
Sure. I'm ready for this question. So,
Okay.
so I think that one way of reading the book, which is I think the wrong way of reading the book, right, is people saying, well, okay, well, you just don't like advertising, right? Okay, or people who agree who'd be like, fine, let's just get rid of all advertising.
Right.
And I think that this is not the question, right? The question isn't necessarily whether or not advertising works or doesn't work. It's not even the case of like whether or not you can identify examples in which advertising is pro-social, right? I think the core question is, do you think that advertising should be the monoculture economy that drives the entire internet? And the humble proposal of the book is maybe that shouldn't be the case, right?
Yeah.
And the internet that I want to see is one where there's just a lot more diversity in business models, right? Where it isn't this one thing that drives sort of everything, particularly in the realm of sort of culture and content online. And so I do think that one note of hope that I would hit is in thinking about kind of like what's happening in the wake of sort of this COVID-driven crisis, really, in the media, right? I do think that suddenly you have people experimenting with worker co-ops, right? People trying out to see whether or not subscriptions are a viable model, right? Yep. And for a long time, I do think that the sort of godlike or oracular status of advertising has actually smothered a lot of other models, right? And that's partially because people can't sort of think of other models, but I think also because, you know, you hear stories from investors that are like, why are you charging subscriptions? We know that advertising works, right? Right. And the sort of pressure to move in this direction. And so in some ways, the fact that advertising is getting hammered right now is actually a great way for potential other models to be tried out, right? And unfortunately, we don't really know, right, what option would be the option that allows us to kind of have the same kind of growth or the same kind of revenue, right, that advertising has generated. But I think in the sort of like seeds of this kind of economic disaster right now, there's sort of the potential to kind of like reset. And I think there's also the potential to kind of really, you know, kind of take the momentum and cause some trouble with the advertising industry that hopefully creates enough time and opportunity for other things to occur and grow. And so that would be sort of my note of hope.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, I feel like, while no one wishes for a recession, you know, say in architecture, you know, a field that I cover quite a lot, you know, we got parklets and, you know, maybe better designed affordable housing and like a field of people who needed to find more meaning and some way to earn at least some money in the work that they were doing that was different than what they'd been doing before. So I think it can bring some level of creative thinking.
Yeah, and I do think that this is a great time to both be experimenting with other stuff, but also to be like chipping away at people's confidence in the ad industry.
Yeah.
You know, I think there's two ways. Yeah, right. Like, I mean, there's one way of reading, you know, all these worries about the ad industry, and you can sort of be an attentional Marxist, right? Where you're like, you know, the contradictions of the economy are eventually going to just bring it down, so we don't need to do anything. But I think it's kind of like there is this maybe window of opportunity that if we don't actively take it.
Uh-oh. Oh, we have frozen Tim. Let's see if Tim can get back. We were doing so well.
Yeah, Tim, you might want to exit out and then come back in again, maybe.
Okay, while Tim is doing that, I want to thank people who have sent questions so far. Please take this opportunity to send some more if you haven't already. I'm also going to advertise myself that everyone should order this book from City Lights or their local independent bookstore as soon as possible. It's great, as are the rest of them in the series. I have a review of Blockchain Chicken Farm, which I'm not sure when you guys are talking about that one. Next day or so, in the Chronicle.
Yeah.
Coincidentally. And as soon as Tim comes back, we will get to some of your very good questions.
We've also got some questions in the chat function as well.
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, please do try and ask your questions in the Q&A. I see them coming. Thank you. Harry comes back.
He's back.
You knew it had to happen one time.
Yeah, for sure. Never go with that.
I wanted to ask you before we go to audience questions. We've been talking a lot about consumer behavior, but obviously what we haven't really got to is too much is the political realm of advertising, and obviously it seems like whether Cambridge Analytica or just the general tenor of everything right now, hopefully there's some reconsideration of how political advertising works, and I'm wondering if you could share any thoughts you might have on that.
Yeah, for sure. I cited the sort of UK privacy regulator report just earlier in the session. And I think it's worth kind of thinking about that, right? Because I think there's one way of reading that report and basically saying, okay, so we don't need to worry about political advertising, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure if I necessarily agree with that. I think it really may be the case that there's a lot to worry about political advertising, but it may not have a lot to do with whether or not political advertising influences people. Mm-hmm. And instead, right, like it may be that the gathering of mass dossiers to do political advertising, right, or the opening of, the opening for like billionaires to buy a huge amount of sort of coverage through mm-hmm. paid advertising, right? Mm-hmm. Like those are the things that actually are ultimately much more corrosive on democracy than it is sort of like the special effectiveness of political ads. Mm-hmm. And so I do think that is one thing that is kind of worth thinking about as we sort of think about how to regulate this stuff, right? Because mm-hmm. I do tend to believe that like we should take action and we should ban certain types of things. Mm-hmm. But again, I think that like it may not rest so hard on, again, to go back to the metaphor I was using earlier, that like that these things are actually kind of like a mind control, right? Like that these things literally allow the people to sort of like shape public perception.
We have a question from Ben Perez, who asks, do you think that companies have already started hedging against this bubble bursting by redirecting their surveillance tech to government contracting and workplace monitoring? And he mentions Ring and Palantir.
Yeah, I think so, actually. I mean, I think all of the companies have always been worried that, most of their wealth is based on, right, this engine that they've mm-hmm. created. And I do think that one way of reading, right, all of the sort of moonshot, quote unquote, experiments that the companies invest in, that's less a marker of strength and more a marker of desperation, right? That they're trying everything they can to try to find some alternative business model. Mm-hmm. And so I do think that, right, the movement of these companies into, say, government contracting, right, and more specifically things like offering cloud services, right, are attempts to hopefully try to balance the books to kind of hedge against this risk. Mm-hmm. And this is something that's called out as a risk factor, right, in the SEC filings of these companies. So I don't think there's any secret there. Mm-hmm. And I think, again, like to talk about the front stage and the backstage, I think this is one way of sort of like reading their activities and their sort of attempts to diversify. I think the other thing is also they're monopolists in one space, so it gives them a lot of ability to go and kind of target other industries to just see where another business might come in. So I think in sort of seeking greater profits, I think that this is also something that they would do anyways.
Okay. John Alderman asks, you've spent a lot of time thinking and writing about AI. Do you think that AI could be more cleverly applied to advertising and attention manipulation to make it more effective, more dangerous, and also more opaque?
Yeah, I guess I'm a skeptic there. Having been very close to a lot of machine learning and AI, one of the most prominent or conspicuous features of it, I suppose, is that a lot of machine learning sort of doesn't work. And I think in some ways the most prominent use of AI that we have right now is sort of the use of AI in policing what's known as brand safety in the industry. So this is the idea that like the sort of programmatic advertising marketplace is so big and so unknowable occasionally your ads will just end up next to white supremacist content, right? And there's a dream that you're going to use AI to deal with this, to filter out and prevent this problem, right? And most of the reports that we have there so far are pretty bleak, right? Like that you will actually be able to use the tool for this purpose. So again, I'm not sort of really confident both in AI making advertising a lot more effective. I also am kind of skeptical in the use of AI to ameliorate some of the problems that we have in the ad economy.
Yeah, I mean, that should be your next book. The limits of AI. Christy Kirsch asks, do you think it's possible that we consider internet access as a human right, thus creating policy to facilitate internet usage for everyone, encouraging a transition from ad to subscription?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the question for me is very clear. At the network level, right? So if the question is, does everybody do we deserve universal access to the web, right? I think the answer is yes, has to be yes, and I think there should be a lot of public support to try to make that happen. And there's countless activists that are out there doing this work, and I think they're doing really good work on this front. I think the kind of interesting intellectual work on this particular question, right, about what is a human right, is less at the network level and more at this kind of platform level. Right? Like, is access to search a human right? Is access to social media a human right? Is access to the newest social media a human right? Right? And I think that question gets a lot more complex, right? And again, it goes to that kind of like very dual nature, or, you know, this sort of battle over the metaphor, right? Like, is Facebook like the electric company, or is it like, you know, a tabloid newspaper, right? And I do think that we are still, as a sort of political discourse around these platforms, still trying to settle on what is the right metaphor. Just because I think we're still not quite sure, because I think a lot of these products and services still sort of blend together so many things that's very difficult to differentiate out. Like, what is the line that you cross to make something truly critical?
Well, I can see as you're talking about that, it's sort of like SNAP benefits, and people are like, well, you can use your SNAP benefits for fresh produce, but not potato chips. You know, that there's like a value judgment that you could see that it would sort of need to be figured out. There's a question in here about. All right, let me see if I can sort of phrase this. Tech companies are trying to get into Zoom-like education to guarantee another decade of profits to stockholders. Do you think algorithms for surveillance done for ads now can be generalized for measurements for high-value child bonds in a hypothetical Google Stanford coding dojo to companies? Where I thought this question was going is, you know, I have a teenage daughter. She's been on Google platform since 5th grade. If she's like, why are you not using Google Slides? You know, like it's become inherent in her brain. So I think that especially in the situation we're at, this is a super interesting question to engage in, is the question of education and advertising. And this question is kind of asking that they might, that tech companies might even pivot more into this, despite, I should say, tech's not so great track record delving into education in many circumstances. But any thoughts about that?
Yeah, sure. So I'll sort of sidestep in some ways, because I feel like I'm not like an expert on ed technology, and I feel like that's a whole crazy universe. But I think the research for the book has gotten me thinking a lot about sort of what the ad-driven internet teaches us, and how it teaches us to interact with others. You know, if you remember in the heady days of Web 2.0, right? You know, people would get on stage and be like, comment threads. Comment threads are the best damn thing on the internet. And, you know, in some ways it's so laughable now, just because if you're a journalist or anyone that produces content online, you know, the general adage now is like, don't read the comments. It's just garbage. It's just the worst thing, you know? And one way of thinking about it, which I often hear, is like, well, we were too optimistic. Those things have never worked properly. But one of the things I'm chasing after is kind of the idea, like, maybe they did work better back then, and actually they work worse now. And you know, one way of thinking about it is, okay, if advertising drives the design of the web, and the design of the web creates certain types of emergent social behavior in people, and we learn to interact with one another through these media, right? Does it mean that we've sort of like learned to just behave and be familiar and be comfortable with sort of like the rancor and the dysfunction of an ad-driven web? And if so, does it make it a lot more difficult to create alternative social medias, right? Because you could create a social media that would be great, but people might just not get it, right? They might just be like, there's no like button. This is terrible, right?
Yeah.
Or, you know, and I do think that that is something that really worries me, because it sort of suggests that if you buy that hypothesis, that there's certain design decisions that are made at a certain point in the history of the web that now lock in public behavior in a way that makes it really difficult for sort of mass adoption of another way of doing things online. And I think that's worrisome, particularly for those who kind of dream of a different internet or an alternative internet.
Though, I mean, I guess without thinking too deeply about that right now, it's like there was no internet not that long ago, and
Sure.
all of us who didn't grow up with it had to figure it out. So, you know, let's hope that there's still possibility for some slightly different model. I think we have time for one more question here. Okay, this is related to COVID. It seems like the media, especially news media, crisis has been going for a while now, driven by the zero marginal cost of digital publishing. Does that narrowing profit margin due to technological efficiency make alternative news media profit models infeasible?
Sure. I mean, I think, so there's a nuance that I bring to that question, right? Which is there's the marginal cost of production, and then there's the marginal cost of distribution, right? And I do think that the problems are really actually that for news or media of any kind, the marginal cost of production has remained the same, you know, in some ways, right? Where you're like, someone's got to go out there and write this thing, or someone's got to go take this photograph. And the problem has been the marginal cost of distributions has gone to zero, right? Yeah. And you know, I do think, again, this goes to kind of like the question of psychological price, right? Which is like, also, what is the market willing to bear for what you're trying to produce, regardless of the amount of effort that you put into producing it. And you know, the metaphor that I always go to, or the comparison that I always go to, is thinking about the world of ebooks, right? Which is, you have Amazon, which is a monopoly, right? Basically saying, look, you're going to buy these text documents that we're going to call ebooks, and they're going to cost exactly the same as a proper book, right? And I think there's a lot of problems with doing things that way, right? Well, one end result is that people don't think twice about paying $15 for what's effectively a Word document, right? And indeed, like one way of,
that way,
yeah, exactly right, right? Like, well, like that, like one way of, you know, and this is a classic trick, right? One way of making a blog post incredibly valuable is to turn it into a 200-page book, right? And sell it as a book. And so I do think that like part of the problem here is the question of like, what do we expect to pay for something? And what is the difference, right? And what are the kind of psychological circumstances under which someone would be willing to pay more? And I do think that there is a kind of question about like how we like construct or frame up content that will totally influence the price that people are willing to pay for it, and ends up being, again, part of this like theater of the market, right? Which is like, how do we turn this into something that people would be willing to pay for in a way that we think is, again, sort of pro-social?
Or alternately, as we've seen pretty much every single newspaper close of late, you know, at what point does the press become a human right? I mean, I think we're going to begin to see that's of course my media bias, but I think we'll begin to see we already have begun to see the fallout of what happens when that happens. And, you know, I do think that various media companies have been experimenting with models, Mother Jones being an example. My bio at the intro was wrong, and I've recently joined City Monitor, which also has a new media business model. So I think that check it out at citymonitor.ai. I think that people are experimenting with new ways of doing this, but it's not an easy road. And writers actually get paid less than they did 50 years ago. It's quite sad, but We need to wrap it up. We could talk all night. I'm so glad we got to talk about magic and Nimbyism and all those things. And it's always a pleasure to talk to you. And I apologize to everyone if I didn't get to your question, but please get the book, get all of the books in this series. They're all really quite wonderful. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
And thanks to both of you. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Allison. And also to our partners at Gray Area, Matt behind the scenes, Nadav, Tiffany. Just to remind everybody, there are 2 more events tomorrow. We have another one on Wednesday. If you'd like to check out the calendar, you can go onto the Gray Area website, grayarea.org, or the City Lights calendar at www.citylights.com. So tonight's event is going to be available for rebroadcast on the Gray Area website. If you know of someone who missed it, or if you'd like to watch it again, visit their site to actually learn more. Thanks again. Please be safe. We hope to see you all soon, and please do buy the books.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.